Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with two very special guests, Delian Asparouhov, investor at Founders Fund, and Felix Ejeckam, founder CEO of Akash. Guys, welcome to the podcast. Felix, why don't you first define what is Akash and what inspired you to start it?
Sure. Akash Systems is a San Francisco-based startup company making gear for the satellite communications industry. The world today is going through a revolution, a transformation in communications. There is a large number of people out there who are not connected to the internet. Something like 3 to 4 billion people are not at all connected to the grid of information. I just came back from Europe, and most of the time I had 3G. You know, around here we get LTE, 4G, and it's taken for granted. But by and large, you get out there in the world, and most people are using 2G. And that gap between what we could have and where we are today is huge, and satellites is aiming to try and close that information gap. And folks like us at Akash are enabling the solution for that gap.
Awesome. And Delian, why don't you tell the story of how you met Felix? Maybe we'll give our mutual friend some credit, and then we get into why you invested.
I originally met Felix by accidentally emailing the wrong Sriram Krishnan. Turns out there's two of them in San Francisco. I was basically trying to email one of them that briefly was basically working at Coastal Ventures. And as I emailed him, I emailed the wrong one. He thankfully put me in touch with the correct one. But I was telling this to like a mutual friend, and he was like, hey, you should actually go hang out with the wrong one as well. Like, he's pretty cool. And so I go hang out with him. I'm like, hey, I just started at Coastal Ventures, interested in space stuff. And he put me, in touch with Felix. And then lo and behold, I ended up doing the seed round at Coastal Ventures and then also doing the Series A at Founders Fund.
I had both of them on the podcast. It was this Sriram Krishnan episode.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
But he didn't introduce me to you, Felix. So
okay.
God damn it, Ram.
Well, I will do a second shout out to Sriram. He is an absolutely brilliant investor. He is a seer. I would use that word. He's very good at visioning and looking far ahead beyond where people are today. He's been an immense supporter of ours at Akash, and I couldn't endorse him any more than I already have.
Yeah, I'm an LP in his fund, and he helped me prepare for this podcast. But that's enough praise for one episode. Delian, why don't you talk about what you saw in Akash that inspired you to invest, and maybe we could zoom out after that and think about how you looked at this category.
Yeah, I think there's sort of like three major points around Akash Systems that I tend to use for analyzing basically any space startup, which is the first is there's a ton of space startups that you hear about that are just unfortunately just way too far out there. Commercial space is still a very nascent industry. And when somebody comes and like pitches you on like, hey, I'm going to make like the next like hotel in outer space, it's like, great. I appreciate it. I'm somebody who's like a sci-fi geek and I want that to exist as well. But like giving you a couple $1,000,000, I like might as well just throw it down the drain. Cause like there's just no way you're going to be able to make like near term progress. And so as Felix kind of mentioned earlier, what they're developing is what powers basically a lot of these communication satellites. And these aren't things that are on like a 10-year time horizon. Like the radios that Akash Systems make, there are already like billions of dollars that are being spent on them. And so let's say, point one is there's a real commercial market that they can be a part of today that like already exists. We're not trying to like reinvent some market. There's no like quote unquote market risk. The second that I'd say is, okay, there are a lot of companies that maybe don't have market risk. They're developing like rocket engines or something like that, or they're making like a star tracker for navigation. But the second risk tends to be, well, you're just developing like a commoditized product where there's a tons of companies, there's this one that I love talking about, which is Blue Canyon that actually we've partnered with before. They make a really cool star tracker. But like, it's not like a real like product. It's not like a massive business. And so they basically turn it into like a satellite manufacturer, but they're basically like a services business in a lot of ways. Like they have 100 million revenue. It's a cool business, but it's basically valued at like 120 million revenue because like there's no differentiation. There's not a ton of margin because of that. And so probably part two is that like Felix is developing something that is like a highly differentiated product for basically work that he's worked on for the past almost like 15 years. He has developed a like material science, basically innovation that is extremely core to Akash Systems, that is very unique and like literally no one in the world is able to touch. but that also has these like massive business implications for his customers. So they're willing to pay him way more. Like typically, a radio is going for, 100K. They're willing to pay him 500K, and he can make a ton of margin on that. And they're only going to go to him. So he can take this, like, as I said, this commercial market that already exists and enter it with a highly differentiated, highly defensible product, that has extreme advantages for his customers. And so he can basically take over that entire market. And then part three, which I think is a part of basically any startup, is like, what is the total addressable market for it, right? This is an industry where, as you said, people are willing to spend a lot of money to get connected online. The like current satellite radio business is already on the order of like a couple of billion a year. The moment that some of these constellations start to go up, whether it's Starlink, whether it's Bezos, whether it's OneWeb, whether maybe one day we do our own, there are going to be tons and tons of people buying radios, and we're going to have the best radio on the market with nobody able to compete. Now, maybe there's some risk that one day people aren't using radios to communicate with satellites, but I'm pretty skeptical. Like, we've been using radios to communicate for a long time. It's probably not changing anytime soon. So those are basically like the three components.
Let's zoom out a bit, Delian. Maybe you could start by giving a little bit of a market map for how you view space in terms of like what are the different subsectors and different areas of which you've looked at investments or might consider making investments for the generalist investor out there who doesn't know much about space, but just sort of wants to get the lay of the land.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's basically like three main areas within the commercial space industry, which are basically, you have effectively like what I call the like satellite operators. And so this is somebody that's sending up like their own equipment into space, and their goal with this is to, somehow produce some data, take some images, communicate, like they're operating their own hardware up there. The second part are, well, who the hell sends up the hardware up there, i.e. the launchers. And so, there's been, the early success of SpaceX, from then Rocket Lab being the second sort of commercial launch provider. And it appears that there's at least like sort of 4 or 5 more that within the next, 2 years are probably going to be able to actually like have successful commercial launches. And then the third part that I put in, which is sometimes a little bit maybe under looked at or under invested in, is what I call like the components provider. So a lot of these satellites are built from not things that the company necessarily makes full stack themselves. Planet Labs relies on a lot of external vendors in order to be able to put together their system and be able to take photos of the Earth. If you can be somebody that in that supply chain that makes a very differentiated component, that's also one way of interacting with the ecosystem.
Let's also zoom out and maybe you give a brief historical overview of how, one thing we talked about before the podcast started is how there's been a big shift from public spending to private spending here. How do you think, even from, the last 2 decades, how has this sort of space evolved? How has venture looked at it? And then we could talk about perhaps where it's going.
Yeah, I mean, a significant amount of credit to this entire shift goes to Elon, given that he was able to take what seemed like a very insurmountable problem, and he has single-handedly started to shift a lot of the mindset of how the space community works. But I'd say the combination of SpaceX having some early success and then Skybox actually selling for a reasonable sort of venture return, which is one of the early space entrepreneurship or space, commercial space investments that Coastal Ventures did, and it returned real money to the fund, and other investors saw that as well, and so we're much more willing to take major bets. How we sort of got to that point was, it's honestly starts from literally back in the 60s with the Apollo program being successful. The way that space used to work back then was everything was basically mission based. So Apollo and the directors of it would say, hey, we want to accomplish this particular mission. And then every private company on Earth would basically go and basically try and provide those hit those specs, and they would basically compete on price on who could hit those specs. Very shortly after the Apollo missions, all human-based space exploration basically shifted to what is cost plus, which is how we do a lot of the budgeting in the government today. And it significantly slowed down our ability to innovate. We continue to move, but at a very, very glacial pace. But it's interesting when you compare the human-based space exploration, which shifted all to cost plus, versus at NASA, everything that's in relation to robotic exploration has always stayed mission-based. And so you can see this amazing explosion of we visited Titan, we visited Venus, we've visited all these moons, we visited Pluto, and have done incredible things on the robotic side. And I think most of the reason why is we've stuck with mission focus. And so the way that any sort of robotic mission happens at NASA is NASA comes up with a spec of hey, we would like to send a probe to X planetary body, and then a bunch of private corporations come in and bid on it. And there's some very interesting, Millennium Engineering is one of the ones that I thought was particularly interesting, founded by this guy Chris Kowiski, that did several of these missions and has done everything from constellations for weather data collection to sending out probes. And so there has been some commercial activity, but it's all been really almost consultancy engineering based that has been around these private missions. And now that I think we're starting to do it on the manned space side, I think that's also been a little bit of the recent explosion in commercial spaces, because on the manned space side, there's also a ton more capital that NASA and the governments of the world are willing to spend towards versus just the robotic missions.
Yeah. When you look at sort of the next decade and you look at where the white space is, where do you think there are going to be, unicorn companies in this category? Maybe in some of the spaces you mentioned or ones we haven't yet?
I'll first start off with there's an incredible book that just recently got published called A Case for Space by this guy Robert Zurini. He originally published a book in like the early 90s, I want to say. It was called A Case for Mars. It was originally basically the book that inspired Elon to go after Mars. And the reason that, you hear that old story of like Elon went to Russia to try and buy rockets. They wouldn't sell him rockets. And so he was like, fuck it, I'm going to create SpaceX. The reason he even went to Russia was because of Robert, because he was trying to launch like one of his probes. Like Robert had this idea to basically go and like, I think it was like map out Mars. But this book covers this in incredible detail and is a great one, highly recommend. But there's a couple of different categories that I think he really breaks down that I like generally fundamentally agree with. The first and hopefully, biggest explosion will start to happen when we start to integrate, basically low Earth orbit based manufacturing into supply chains of components. So the one that is most talked about, or is at least seems like the most likely to happen, is around the manufacturing of fiber optic cables. There's a very clear pre-existing market on Earth today for fiber optic cables, and there's a clear linear line or up and to the right line that signifies basically the price that people are willing to pay for fiber optic cable and the quality of that fiber optic cable. The main reason is with fiber optic cables, you're trying to stretch it underneath the Atlantic to like provide internet for the entire world. The higher quality of the fiber optic cable, the less amplification stations you need to run when there's basically attenuation in the cable, meaning basically like the signal decreases, and it gets to some point where it's too low, and you have to literally put a physical fucking station like underneath the Atlantic that basically like spikes the signal like back up. If you have a super high quality fiber optic cable, technically you shouldn't even need to run that station. You should be able to have one cable start in Miami and the other one go to London, and there shouldn't be any amplification. We've already shown early proof. There's this company called Made in Space that has proved at least early signal of being able to basically manufacture fiber optic cables in a very low or effectively no gravity environment, because most of basically the imperfections in fiber optic cables, it's basically just melted glass. And a lot of the imperfections literally just come from basically it being manufactured in a gravity field and the top being more dense with glass than like the bottom, or the bottom being more dense than the top, and there also being like small air bubbles. Turns out if you build it in a vacuum with zero gravity, you can literally build a perfect tube of glass. And so he runs through the economics of this in this book, where it's like, we're actually not that far away. Like if you continue to watch the like curve of basically like the dollars it costs per kilogram to send something up into space, we're not that far away from being able to introduce that stuff into the supply chain and have it actually be affordable. There's a ton of then knock-on effects that start to happen, because like the moment, okay, you start to have this particular thing, like, manufacturing space, well, then it's like, okay, well, that, factory that's building that occasionally needs servicing, and it needs fuel, and there's all these sort of like follow-on things. But I think the first thing that starts to happen is like when manufacturing starts to happen in space. Because the moment you have some heavy industry there, the most difficult part of space exploration is the rocket equation. The heavier something gets on Earth that you need to launch up, the exponential amount of fuel that you need to send things up there. And so our ideal end state for humanity is not actually bringing any heavy things up and down from Earth. It's having the heavy things built outside of Earth, and like the only things that are coming up and down from the surface are just like the meat bags, i.e. like the people. And so that's maybe like the early areas. I think there will start to be not just fiber optic cables, but other products that, whether it's, I think, we've shown early signals of certain like, drugs that can be manufactured better in low gravity environments. There's a variety of different sort of like industrial products that I think will start to utilize basically that manufacturing capacity.
If you had to categorize sort of like different waves of space investing, either past, present, future, like where are we right now?
Oh my God, we're still in like very much the early days. I mean, there was like, the pioneers that maybe tried in the 90s, didn't have a ton of success. There's the, 2000s and like basically like, Elon and like Skybox effectively being the only successes. And now it feels like there's been feels like maybe like the first wave failed. The second wave had like at least a handful of successes. The third wave feels like it's going to manufacture at least, I could bet on, let's say the top 20 companies today in like the space industry, I would say that like 5 of them I think are like going to become unicorns. And I think that's only going to further propel. Like the way that I kind of maybe analyze it in a different way is right now I think it'd be really hard for me to define my entire venture career just doing commercial space. I'd like to say that I spend maybe like 10, 15, maybe 20% of my time. I go to conferences, I talk to entrepreneurs, I talk to experts, I help, Felix. But I do think that it is going to be possible by around, let's say like, by 2024, 2025, I think one could very easily have like a venture career that is like a majority of the time is spent on commercial space.
Right now you're like partly space. The rest is full on ICOs.
Yeah. Oh God. I mean, I sometimes joke that like I only do the rest of the shit just to pay for the time that I get to like do the space stuff. And then like, I really just want to do the space stuff full time. Totally. Like that'd be an amazing job.
Totally. Felix, how would you be thinking about space from a VC perspective, or put differently, when your generalist investor friends come to you and ask what should they be looking at, or any advice that you give them as it relates to investing in the category?
Two sectors come to mind that, and I borrow pages from, let's say, going back and looking at the telecom, growth bubble and burst, and then the .com before that, and we've had many cycles in Silicon Valley over the last 20 years. I would say that tried and true strategies can revolve around investing in the picks and shovels of what will become, what everyone agrees will be a big space, pun intended. So all the folks who are supplying or making gear for space, and I think that there are going to be certain winners in there. So if you can go there and find critical folks in the supply chain, that could be a winning strategy. I think a second is, so right now we're going through a phase now in space and new space where we're building the platform. Okay, we're building the bed upon which ultimately we're going to be delivering data and valuable services to consumers around the world. And that hasn't really come to fruition yet. I think that there are going to be some very innovative companies who will deliver very, very exciting value through data, whether it's in the form of Earth observation, visible, invisible infrared. There's a need that people have for wanting information about themselves, about their lives, about the world around them, and we haven't touched that yet. And I think that's another potential wave. We were talking about waves earlier of opportunities that I think could be coming around the corner. And I don't think we may even have seen the winners. They may not have been born yet. I mean, Google was search engine number 16. They came at a time when Yahoo was already declared the winner. So I think that it's still very much early days.
One of my favorite examples to give is I think a lot of people think they're like, oh, you put a satellite up there and like, okay, it takes pictures of Earth, but like, okay, then we're done. We're just taking a picture of Earth. What they don't realize is there are so many different use cases for having a satellite up there. So here's one that's like in some ways a niche example, but this is like a multi-billion-dollar market. So for the longest time, the way that we basically did all weather collection data in the United States in order to be able to like model weather, model hurricanes was basically sending up like balloons that basically had like, some sensors on it that would basically collect like humidity, pressure, etc. But like sending up a balloon, one, it's pretty infrequent data collection. And then two, you can only basically send up those balloons over land. Like it's hard to like send ships out with like balloons on a very regular basis. And so you're not getting like that much continuous weather. And so for a very long time, our ability to like model just like the weather on Earth was pretty damn poor. In the early 90s, basically NOAA was tasked with like trying to fix this project. And so there was these early experiments that basically utilized the fact that we already had a series of GPS satellites. And they're like, okay, well, since the GPS satellites are already up there, what we'll do is we'll put up a satellite that it's in a much lower orbit. Like the GPS satellites are super, super high up. We're going to put a little satellite that's like in a much lower orbit. And what we'll do is we'll watch when basically one of those GPS satellites is on the horizon opposite from us. And we're going to watch that GPS satellite signal rather than hitting the Earth and like going to your phone. It does also come to our satellite and hits us. But as it comes to us, it actually basically like passes through the atmosphere on the way and actually gets somewhat refracted by the humidity, the pressure, the water, et cetera, in the atmosphere. And it turns out you can actually use that as a way to basically constantly monitor the humidity, pressure, et cetera, all over the globe because you have all these GPS satellites. You have all these little ones that are basically listening to the GPS satellites. And it's one of the most effective ways of basically collecting weather data. So we launched an early constellation like the mid-90s. We launched a second one in like 2000, and it was an absolute game changer. Like the only reason that we're now even able to like remotely monitor like some of these hurricanes and actually be able to give even 2-3 day predictions, we were not able to do that before like the, early 90s. It was basically just like a complete flip of the coin. Hurricanes hit when we, would basically just see them. However, still super limited. We only have, I think like right now, 8 operational satellites or something like that up there. And so there's been this interesting shift where, I think part of the original motivation was maybe Trump/Pence not believing in climate change, but they basically were like, we're going to slash NOAA's budget by like a third or something like that. We're going to take it from $1.5 billion to like $500 million a year. And so the NOAA directors were like, well, shit, we can't afford like our old school like government space program. So, okay, well, we're just going to put out a spec of here's how much, weather data that we would really like to collect. lo and behold, private companies started launching that were basically focused on collecting weather data in this way, but in a much cheaper way. And so now there's like 3 different companies that are basically now fulfilling like NOAA specs and are now collecting data at like 1/1000th the cost of what a government-made satellite could do. And so, within the next couple of years, there's going to be like not just 8 satellites that are collecting weather data, but like 80 or 800. And that's just like one example use case of like you can collect weather data, you can collect imaging data, you can get infrared, you can look at like methane leaks from like a gas pipe. And like each of these requires very, very different types of equipment, different types of data communications, different types of orbits. And so I think sometimes people get too stuck or narrow in like what are the like potential applications for a satellite? Like I can list off hundreds and hundreds of applications, and you can't just send out like some like general purpose satellite to do all these. Like each of these needs their own orbit, needs their own hardware. And a lot of these markets are like really massive markets. Like I think by 2022, there is a very likely chance that we will be able to do like 14 plus day out weather predictions that are like near perfect across the entire globe. Let me tell you, there's like a lot of people that are going to be willing to pay for that data. Like insurance companies, hedge funds, like, ship companies that are navigating across the Pacific trying to avoid storms. Like that's a pretty freaking damn big market. And like, I guarantee you've never heard of the name of like any of these 3 companies. And like, they are tackling like a multi-billion-dollar market.
I was going to say that this is actually not such a far-fetched thing. These are real ideas that are being pushed right now by various startups. There's a company that reached out to us recently, an NGO, asking us if we could provide satellites to them or services to them to help them collect data from fishermen around the world. So this NGO works with various governmental bodies around the world to make sure that fishermen, especially in the Pacific around Asia, do not collect, catch, and keep endangered species. And oftentimes they do. And the way they try to monitor it is to have a camera that's constantly surveilling what the fishermen are doing and transmitting that data live. And there's AI and software to constantly to be able to tell when something nefarious is happening. If they're actually, did they catch a turtle that they shouldn't have caught? Did they let it go? Did they keep it? And all of that is being processed real time. And that they and their vision thought could be possible with a satellite. So they reached out to us to implement that as an example. Talking about the infinite number of applications. I think, in ways that touch people's lives, the potential you were talking about fiber, very expensive fiber to go across the ocean, running that fiber through terrain, through the Amazon, through, Northern Africa, gets very expensive. Okay. There is the potential to crash the cost of access 100, 1,000 times lower than where it is today. You do that, you are enabling new industries, commerce. You're going to create, new states around the world when all of a sudden the cost of access is not a barrier anymore. That's an example. Imaging. I mean, there's almost countless examples of that. And even without getting close to privacy concerns, but just being able to, so we got reached out to recently by a company that wants to use satellite images to enable cars, basically assisting your GPS travel and navigation on the roads. If the access were rapid and precise, that could be another layer of your navigational system for autopilot driving. So besides just radar, but also looking 10 cars ahead, 5 cars ahead, and giving precise right now information about what's coming down the pike. So anyway, yeah. There's almost no end to the applications that are possible in real companies that are pursuing these ventures.
Yeah. 10 years from now, or a decade, 2 decades from now, what will be viewed as the iPhone moment in space? Has it already happened? What will it look like? And then similarly, what will need to be true for companies to be thinking about having a space strategy the way companies thought about having a mobile strategy?
I think the iPhone moment is happening likely right now. I think a number of companies that are putting up the infrastructure, the sort of the baseline internet platform upon which many of these things will be built upon. I think that's happening right now, and it'll take some form of a combination of what Elon Musk is doing, what Jeff Bezos is doing, and they're all doing things to maximize their own need, their own application. And in some cases, they're not really competing with each other. And likewise with us, we will be up there in some form, and others that are coming along today. So I think that right now the platform is being built, and then in 10 years you'll start to have a lot more of the services.
Yeah, and talk more about what the difference is between what Musk and Bezos are doing.
So I can't speak for the two companies. I have tremendous amount of respect for both what they're doing, but the public statements show that Jeff and Amazon is ultimately trying to maximize access and reduce cost to products for their users. So, ultimately, I think that if you're Amazon, you want anyone, anywhere to be able to order anything and have it come to you in maybe 5 minutes tops, regardless of where you are. And anything that stands in the way of that is cost that needs to be removed. Satellites can help you do that a bit more. It's not the complete solution, but it is a step in that direction. And then if you're Jeff Bezos, if you're Elon Musk, he's talked about essentially transferring the internet to the sky. So making access ubiquitous is a key objective of some of their public statements. Yeah.
It's funny. I think I would define like the iPhone moment like a little bit maybe differently. I can't actually decide. I maybe have like a little bit of like two answers to it. The first, which is the moment I think that there is like a human that is in orbit for a commercial reason, I think is like to me like the iPhone or like breakthrough moment. Because the moment there's like a commercial reason for somebody to be up there, there are so many then trickle down effects that start to happen of like that person needs water, that person needs rides back up and down, that person needs fuel, that person needs air, that person needs materials. There are so many different things that I think will start to explode the moment that it becomes like economical and there makes sense for there to be a reason for somebody to be up there for some sort of commercial application. And there almost certainly will be. I mean, like we're nowhere near being able to do the like sort of fine detailed and human ingenious and like fine motor movements that humans do during manufacturing steps. Like there's only so much that you can do with basically like automated robots. So I was trying to decide between that, which I think will have a lot of trickle down effects, and the other one, which is something that like Elon has obviously already like, published videos on, but the ability to do rocket based point to point transportation across the earth, I think will be a massive game changer for the commercial space industry. Even though it's largely a terrestrial based product, the problem right now with most launch costs is like they're basically trying to amortize over the course of like, SpaceX has done 10 launches so far this year, planning to do like 18 or so, projecting for, hopefully double that in like the following year. But they have to amortize all of their commercial or all of their like corporate costs across just those number of launches. If you're able to make it economical for people to do point to point transports and make it so that it costs roughly the, same as like a first class flight, which like all the physics and everything and like the amount of fuel that it should take should support that. Massive game changer. Because now all of a sudden you're saying, okay, rather than like SpaceX doing like, 10 flights a year or something like that, it's hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of flights. And the moment that like starts to become even remotely economical, it's just going to crater the cost, right? Because now all of a sudden they have incentive to compete against airlines. And like the moment that you're competing against like airlines and trying to continue to lower your costs, it's just going to make it so that like that first flight makes it somewhat economical. And then, oh my God, it's just going to explode after that.
I remember the moment when I could go to Google for the first time and see like Google Earth View, or Street View. That was like a moment when you thought, okay, this is the sort of the future is here. I think I like what you said about, when we have people in space. I think a related point could be when we have people, consumers, able to control, a satellite in space, like have take a joystick and move, the image that's being captured from your backyard, So, I think if people had control over something in orbit, that could be like the moment when someone, like an iPhone moment when, something so powerful is now in the hands of an ordinary person.
And does companies have a space strategy? Does that analogy make any sense? Or not really? Companies having a space strategy the way they had a mobile strategy?
I think eventually, yes, because what space does is it democratizes information. It makes ubiquitous access. It drops the cost of access. And if you want to reach, tens of billions of people rapidly, that is a great way to do so. So yes, I think that there will come a point in time when someone is going to provide a platform for that.
And there's almost like, I mean, I think almost every company in the world would love to have more information and more data on like what is happening in the world around them. Whether again, you're a shipping company trying to like move boats across the Atlantic, or hell, even if like you're Open Door and trying to like, analyze the roofs of various houses and see how they're changing so you can watch somebody doing repairs. Like, yeah, I mean, I think at some point, whether or not they're actually like operating space, but if they're partnering with some sort of space company or purchasing some amount of like space data, I think at some point it's going to be like a no-brainer. Like you have to utilize that set of data. It's like not having a strategy for being on the internet. Like how would you not, utilize information that's on the internet? Same thing. How would you not utilize information that's coming from space?
Yeah. And how do you think about space investing different than other categories? For example, when you have to communicate deals or about the category to your partners at Founders Fund who may be unfamiliar with the category, what are the biggest differences or?
Yeah, I mean, by far the biggest one is basically like timeline, right? Like I have to be able to convince them like why this is something that is actually like in the venture or scale of returns. Cause look, we are, major shareholders in SpaceX and are like super happy with like how the company has performed. We have, very large holdings in it. At the same time, like, that company's been around for a very long time and isn't a particularly like liquid investment, even though it's like one of the best investments like to date. And so, I think that's something that, with so few N of companies, it's the biggest question that's on most investors' mind is like, look, does this category, does this asset class perform similar to other venture asset classes that have, enterprise software now has like a lot of examples of like returning funds. Space is still relatively limited. Like Skybox is one of the few that is like, return liquidity back to its investors. And so that's by far the number one question that sort of people are wondering about. And so that's why when you talked about earlier, it was like, why did I invest in Akash? The number one filter was, okay, this is a company that can like start making like real revenues, not in like 10 years, not in 5 years, but in like a year. Like they can start selling radios to like commercial operators, like the Elons, like the Jeff Bezoses, like the Airbuses, like the Spires, like, across the gambit of like, they don't even have one type of customer. It's literally anybody that's communicating with their satellite. And it turns out that's basically everyone in space. Everybody wants to communicate to their satellite. And so I apply that number one filter. And unfortunately, like very few companies hit that filter. There's tons and tons of interesting like satellite propulsion companies that are making satellites move around faster. But it's like, okay, well, somebody's going to need to take a bet on your new propulsion system. And then if that goes well, then in another year, 2 people will take the bet. And then after that, maybe 5 people versus like with radios, people have used radios for a long time.
Yeah. And I'm curious, do you disagree with other people who focus on space? Like, what are the major disagreements within the field, or if there aren't any that come to mind, what do you learn? I mean, you're going out to conferences in like Kansas, Nebraska. Where are these conferences?
Yeah, they're one of them's in Utah, which is convenient for me in some ways. Unfortunately, it's not in like Salt Lake where my parents are. It's like in the middle of nowhere, Logan, Utah. It is a beautiful town, but really in the middle of nowhere. It's a good question. I mean, there's honestly, the thing is like, there's so few venture investors that know anything about space. Like I can list off basically like the 5. It's like David Cohen at Bessemer. It's like Sven Strabend at Coastal Ventures. It's the DCVC guys, Lux Capital, Jurvetson with his new fund. I think it's called like Future Ventures. And then that's about it.
I mean, already hardware as a category is a lot less than software, maybe by a factor of 10. And within hardware, space is even fewer. And he just rattled off the names of the folks who will do it. And I think one thing that scares people off oftentimes is just the amount of capital required to go into a company, between, inception and exit. Yeah. It's oftentimes a lot more than in a software or SaaS.
One area that I find like a lot of ways that I disagree with people is they tend to be comfortable with the sort of defensibility or differentiator being just like cost of capital being the main defensibility. And that's where I see like a ton of people like investing these operating, like, where they're like sending up like a satellite. And I'm like, your satellite is just like a series of components like manufactured by a ton of third-party vendors. There's no real proprietary like component data or anything here. Like, yeah, you're going to be able to make money and you should be able to continue to raise and like send up more satellites. But like, if this starts to be successful, there's a lot of other people that can raise and send up like your identical satellite. Yeah. And so that's maybe one area where I disagree, where like I haven't been particularly impressed by a lot of the like up and coming, let's say like satellite operators. Yeah, I think that's probably like the biggest difference that I've seen amongst people.
What do you learn at these conferences that, I assume these other people aren't going? So what are they, when you're sort of taking photos with goats in Utah, what are they, I'm just kidding. What are they missing out on? What do they not understand?
For what it's worth, I did tweet that and I criticized the fact that there were no other Silicon Valley VCs there. And then for what it's worth, there were actually 2 DC VC guys.
Oh, you gave up your strategy.
So there were technically others, but very, very, very few. One of the most interesting things is just like literally just like, surveying the like, floor of these conferences and just seeing like what is the up and coming research? What are people working on? Like what are the various operators? It's such a great way of like, I think with this type of industry, and it's probably true with many different industries, is like there's not any like physics constraints to anything. Like we could build a lunar base tomorrow. All of these constraints are just like, how can we use the like current physics that's available to us to like start to satisfy customer demand? And a lot of this customer demand is like sometimes just like these one-off deals. Like one example that I like to give is like there's this company called Astrobotic that like, I met about a year and a half ago. Great entrepreneur, but like crazy business model. It was just like, I'm going to go out and build a lunar base. And I was like, I can't, like, I love you. And it looks like you're making progress, but like, I can't invest in that. Like, that's crazy. And I'm like, but like, how do you have already like $12 million in revenue? Like you don't have a product. You haven't done anything. He's like, well, DHL paid me $8 million because DHL wants their logo on like the lunar base. And so they're willing to pay $8 million before we have any progress. I'm like, that's insane. Like, how do I even think of that as a venture investor? Like, I can't, like, are you going to be able to close more of those? Like, are there going to be more logos on your lunar base? But like, what's the point? Like, I guess it's marketing.
And then there's
like,
the one who's building a hotel in space. And then I have a friend who's actually putting up a university on the moon.
The lunar base, though, just got awarded like a $30 million contract from NASA. And so some of these actually do turn into like kind of real projects. And like they're now actually going to go for a launch. They like have their whole plan and they have all the funding that they now need. And so sometimes some of these companies just like, there are some that it's just like, you know what? I just can't, take a look at this, really understand it. Because like you just really need to understand like the government contract super well. And I'm not the guy. So there's, I think, almost like two categories of types of investors in sort of space companies, which are, I understand the commercial world and commercial space really well, but there is a whole world of like, defense and government space that like I don't really touch because like you need to really understand those government relationships and what is the chance of something like that happening.
The DHL thing, was that going to be a business model to advertising, like to get logos from other companies that want to stick up there?
They only did it for DHL and their next contract was NASA, which was $30 million contract. But like if you had asked me a year ago, like, do you think this guy's gonna be able to win the $30 million contract from NASA? And I'm like, I mean, there's like 5 different lunar base companies. Like, I get that his has the most money right now, but is it really the best one? But yeah, I mean, I guess props to that entrepreneur. He managed to take it from like kind of an idea to raising a couple $100K from like, random angels to then convincing DHL to give him a ton of money. And then because DHL gave him money, NASA gave him money. And so part of the skill sometimes in space is like, especially if you're on the government side, is like you kind of need to fundraise for like a wish or a dream in some ways. And so what I love going to these conferences is seeing these people and see them, okay, like, wow, I did not think there was a commercial application here, but you were somehow able to find like a source of funding. Like OneWeb has raised like, I don't even know, like $600 million.
No more.
1.3 billion. I don't even know, something like that. It's like some crazy amount of money. They've like yet to have generated revenue, right? And so a lot of going to these conferences is just watching some of these things and be like, okay, that's a lot of money. But if that starts to work, then there's tons of commercial applications. Like Akash Systems makes radios for OneWeb now. And like that could be a real customer. It's really important for me to go to it and like watch OneWeb because I'm like, okay, now that crazy like government project or whatever got funded or some billionaire decided to spend money, what are all the commercial implications? Because now there's real customers for some of these things that like the physics works for, but there just hasn't been customers yet.
Yeah. Talk more about the public-private relationship and how that has evolved. We alluded to it and how you expect it to evolve over time. Because, governments and startups work together in space. And because Trump is the official entrepreneur in residence of Founders Fund, maybe you could talk, from that perspective. I'm just kidding.
No. I mean, I think we like to be public about the fact that, we are supporters of the administration, or at least, Peter is, whether or not everyone at the firm is. But no, I mean, I think it's one area that actually, I don't think it's been necessarily as much Trump. I mean, maybe him sort of pushing from a high level, but I think Pence has done a really remarkable job with the commercialization of space. He started to push towards, and, I really credit, one of our partners, Trey Stevens is, I would say, probably the most influential, public investor, let's say, or like a defense-based investor, has, close ties to a lot of that community. And there is starting to be a shift across the entire government in a variety of different ways, but more accelerated in space, going back to that original analogy that I gave, which is mission-based versus spec-based. And I think SpaceX really helped sort of shift the curve. Like, it used to be that, like, the government went to ULA and was just like, we need to launch this satellite, like, tell us how much it costs you, and we'll pay you 20% above that. And obviously ULA is incentivized to make their launch cost like $1.3 billion. When SpaceX comes in and says we can launch it for $100 million, well, like, the government, like, is obligated to, like, take a serious look. And, like, I mean, SpaceX has gone through many lawsuits to, like, get to this point, but, like, now the government is obligated to, if somebody comes and meets your spec at a lower price. And so now a lot of the human-based exploration, a lot of these big government projects are starting to be more spec-based. And so I think there will only continue to be a trend in that direction. It's clearly already happened in like the robotic exploration, but I think that will continue to happen with some of our larger like human-based explorations.
Yeah. we think about, we were talking about the iPhone moment earlier. When you think about the future of the space startup ecosystem, will it look similar to the current app ecosystem where there are a few core platforms like iOS and Android and thousands of startups developing components, applications on top of it, or will it look like something else?
I think it will eventually. So initially there needs to be there's going to be a plethora of solutions out there, companies like us trying to advance a standard. And at some point there's going to be a shakeout. There will be a crash of some sort and many companies will fold and there'll be a few standing and the few standing will set the standards and everyone will sort of fall in line and use those standards. So that happens in every industry, happens in every sector. It's happened for decades, and I think that this will not be any different. And so that's partly why you want to go early and try to have a say in how things work out. So things like what frequency bands and what types of already we only have a handful of launchers out there. Relatively small number, and I think it'll probably come down a bit more as well. The form factor of the satellites are sort of, becoming standardized. So I think that there's going to be a coalescing eventually. Not right now. Right now it's still sort of free for all and it's a mad rush, a gold rush, to try and be a player and have a say in the way things work out.
Yeah, I don't think it'll be like as if the entire ecosystem is just controlled by let's say two companies and tons of developers per se. But I think what you're starting to see is across every single step of the supply chain, you're already starting to see the hints of consolidations. Like in the launcher market, the launcher market's not that large. And the moment that SpaceX continues to really drop the cost in heavy launch and if Rocket Lab continues on the path that they are, it's going to be really hard for somebody to start a new heavy launch company or a new light launch company and try and compete against them. You might be able to go, okay, I'm going to go even lighter launch than where Rocket Lab is, the miniature launchers. But again, that's not even that big of a market today. And you're seeing this not just in the launcher market, but you're seeing this in the radio market, for example, the company that one of, Felix's co-founders, was a part of before, has, significantly taken over the market share of radios and is now starting to become the standardized component. And occasionally, right, I do think Felix is going to be able to take over that market as well. But the same thing is happening in solar panels, in cameras, in the form factors, in the GPUs. They're starting to just be, if you look at the number of satellites that are sent up, and especially on the smaller side, they're starting to there's a steady march towards consolidation and standardization of these components. And I think within each of these components, there's going to be two, maybe three major players that represent 90+% of the market share effectively. But it's going to be each company is going to have a sliver of what it takes to basically build a satellite in operation, right? There's going to be the chassis, there's going to be the power units, there's going to be the supply chains, there's going to be the propulsion systems. And in each of those, there's going to be three major players that I think shake out. And then those major players will compete against each other and continue to march things forward. And once in every 5 to 10 years, some new player comes in with some massive new game-changing technology and becomes one of those top three. But we're very quickly starting to see that consolidation across a variety of different steps in the supply chain.
It's important to note that this is actually the third wave of space. We actually started out with, there was Teledesic and Iridium actually were predecessors to all the companies that we're talking about now. And so it's interesting to see the evolution of space now and how where it's come from. I think there's still many lives ahead. Easily another 10 years before we start to see this industry become sort of, quote, mature. There's still so much life ahead, so much to do. Even as I think there's a lot of talk about an economic downturn. Are we going to have a slowdown, a recession? I think that even with that, you'll still have a lot of activity in space. That's my sense. Just one thing we haven't talked about is the demand pull for everything that we're talking about on the market side. I think that there's an extraordinary backbreaking demand for data. That wasn't there before. And I think that is the justification for so much push into space. So if you look at data being consumed today, I think we're consuming data on the order of 10 to the 18, 10 to the 19 bytes per month. If you look at the world we'd like to see, it's something like 10 to the 50, 30 orders of magnitude difference. And that is what is pulling so many companies to try and do something to provide information, whether it's to consume or to do something with or to make things in space. I think as long as you have that demand there, this industry will weather whatever recession or downturn that may come along in the next few years.
Yeah, my maybe 2 points is the advent of the smartphone has made it so that these communications platforms actually have demand. And I think what maybe people don't appreciate is that there's significant quality of life improvements that can happen on Earth based off of like things that we actually like build in space is, I would say, maybe like point one. And then point two is we're on like the very early signals of like an exponential curve, but you're already starting to see it. Like the number of launches that are happening per year, the number of satellites that are getting sent up, the number of companies that like are achieving certain like, revenue milestones is like clearly exponentially growing, and we're still in like the very early curve of the exponential curve, and like it has a very, very high to maybe potentially like unlimited upside. You very rarely see markets like that. Like we are capped on the markets in some ways on Earth. Like there's only so many resources. Space is one of the few places where there is literally uncapped upside. And so I tend to think like, look, I don't understand how any kid that is growing up today or any venture capitalist that is like starting up, how do you like not pay attention to space? It is literally the like largest and most like fastest growing and highest potential TAM market ever invented.
I also think there'll be tremendous upheaval in the lay of the land of companies that exist today in sort of old worlds, pre-space. So I think telecom, if you add up the top 10 telecom companies in the world today, AT&T, Verizon, Vodafone, Orange, China Telecom, it's about $1 trillion, just the top 10. These companies will go through immense shakeouts. Some of them will cease to exist, some will be acquired, and others will have to acquire some of these space companies that are coming along because, effectively, people have limited dollars to spend. If they're not spending it with, an existing company today, they're spending it with, with someone new. And so, there's going to be some major changes in the world as we know it, of the commercial world as we know it today. Actually, it's not unlike the cell phone market. If you look at the top 5 cellular companies 5 years ago, 10 years ago, companies like Ericsson, Motorola were features, and today it's totally different cast of characters. So
It took about 15 years from like the .com boom to eventually all of the like most valuable companies on Earth, all being tech companies. We're at roughly, I would say, the .com moment for space. In about 15 years, all of the most valuable companies on Earth are going to have some relation to space.
Remember Amazon? It took them 10 years. I think they were the last of the first .comers to turn a profit. And now they're...
Yeah. Just to go off the rails for a second, when are we going to be living in space, and will there be sort of a great colonization war, and how do you see that playing out?
Predictions. I never like predictions, but I will say living in space, I think we're not very far. Is it 5 years? No.
Living in space, 5 years?
Did you say, you said living in space, right? I don't think I think 5 years is too soon. I think, I would say somewhere between 10 and 20, maybe 15-ish. I think that you will have the first few people. I mean, we sort of kind of do with the space station. It's people spending months, maybe, I think the record is over a year. Living in space, I would say, within the next generation, 15 to 20 years.
Yeah, I may be more aggressive. I would say, I think by 2025, you'll have 1,000 people that are consistently, and again, living, I think, is difficult because, are the people on the ISS living there?
So what's the definition of living?
There?
What's the definition?
But I'd say 1,000 people continuously, in one moment, there will be 1,000 people basically.
When do we become a multiplanetary species?
Yeah, I mean, Mars colony that's actually self-thriving, doesn't require regular shipments from Earth. That unfortunately are still pretty far away.
Supply chain from Earth.
So 2045 maybe is probably the area.
Wow.
So we're at 2019. So 25.
And we don't foresee a great war over
I think there will be. We can be bad. We can be a bad species. I think there will eventually be problems, but not right now.
Yeah.
All I'll say is for the longest time, my life goal has always been to become the space Putin. And
that is so funny.
I told this to my girlfriend on our second date or something like that. And she's like, I really have a huge crush on Putin, but I need you to explain what the fuck space Putin means. And I started explaining, and I'm like, look, I mean, in all of human history, anytime there's been a small society isolated from the rest of society, typically the small society has been in a very totalitarian regime. And so the early extraterrestrial societies are going to look like military regimes with a dictator effectively. And I'm very skeptical that it's going to look
And you want to be that dictator.
I mean, someone's got to do it.
Somebody's got to do it. Yeah. My goal is for that to be me. And so saying that publicly.
On that note, my guests today have been Delian Asparouhov at Founders Fund and Felix Ejeckam at Akash Systems. Felix, Delian, thank you so much for a wonderful podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.